Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Marche. I'm the webinar director here at Advice Chaser. Before we introduce our guest and get started, I do need to do a little bit of legal housekeeping. Advice Chaser, the host of this webinar, is not a registered investment advisor. We cannot and do not give financial advice. Today's presentation is for educational purposes only and cannot be considered advice for any person's individual situation. Advice Chaser regularly hosts informative webinars, such as this one, featuring a variety of knowledgeable professionals, many of whom are licensed advisors. Any opinions, ideas, jokes, or principles expressed by presenters are their own, and however true, funny, or interesting are not endorsed by Advice Chaser. Please do not act on the information you hear today without consulting a qualified financial professional. And Dave, you can go over to the next slide. We are thrilled to bring you this educational presentation today. Attendees are muted, but we do encourage you to ask questions using the chat box. And if we get any questions, we will go ahead and make sure someone reaches out to you after today's event to address those questions. We want this experience to be as educational as possible, so please don't hesitate to use the chat box if you have a question. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Well, I am thrilled to have as our guest, Dave Grant. Dave Grant is a certified financial planner professional and the owner of Retirement Matters. Dave has provided fee-only fiduciary financial advice to his clients since 2007 and specializes in retirement income planning. His initial focus with clients is to help them understand what they want to achieve in life, what goals to set, and how important those goals are in comparison to one another. It's then his job to bring the best investing and retirement income strategies to aid in building an ideal life and having a customized financial plan at his clients' fingertips. And we're so excited to have you here today, Dave. And I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Marche. Well, as I look at that picture and then look at my picture in the video, I realize how much hair I am now losing. So I think I need to update that photograph. But we're not here to talk about my hair. So we are going to discuss simplifying your financial life before retirement. And that comes along in a various number of different avenues. And people, when I bring this topic up, they say, well, I think my life is simple anyway. What do I really need to be doing? So there's a number of different things that we can look at. But first, we're going to start with the why. Retirement is supposed to be that time where everyone is approaching with a number of different emotions. Some people are excited, some people are nervous. Other people are thinking, this is the stage of my life I've been working towards for 30, 40 years, and this is where I get to have fun. It doesn't become fun until you take care of all the, everyday monotony of life when you talk about your finances. And so once you've taken care of that, it takes away stress, it takes away kind of everyday life, and you can start to really focus on, okay, well, what do I want to do with retirement? How do I want this to be, the best years of my life? How do I want to make sure that I'm, getting the most out of my relationships, my experiences, and really living retirement to the fullest? So the first thing we're going to look at is consolidation. So this comes in many formats. So for one thing you can look at your bank and say, okay, am I using more than one bank? If you are, now is the time to say, well, do I really need to do that? And if I don't, why don't you just choose one bank to use? That in itself can be a process, because lots of people have used different banks for the entirety of their lives. And now you're getting to a point where you're trying to simplify things. A lot of life can be tied up in those, different accounts and different banks that you have. So let's say you decide, okay, I'm going to use one bank. Let's use Chase Bank, for example, because I did that recently and I've gone through that process. It's not fun. Now you have to say, okay, well, if I'm going to live my life as simply as possible, maybe we just go down to one checking and one savings account. I have lots of checking and savings accounts. So this makes me nervous when I think about that, because now all of your life is just going to get squished down into as few accounts as possible. You have to polls there and say, well, does this work for, me if I'm alone, or if you're with a partner, does this work for us? Is this going to materially change how we're using our finances pre-retirement going into retirement? If it's a huge shift and change in how you're working your finances, maybe you take a pause and say, okay, if we're moving from 2 banks down to 1, maybe we keep the same amount of accounts, but you try and simplify things as much as you can. You can also look at, instead of just the checking and savings, let's look at credit cards too. If you're using a number of different credit cards for a number of different reasons, maybe you start to slim that down. You could say, well, let's just have one credit card for all of our purchases. Let's pick the best one in terms of rewards or interest rate, or if it's simplifying, with one bank, let's have a credit card linked to that bank so everything's very streamlined. And you try and make sure that your life is as simple as possible. So as you're looking at banks, login details go with that as well. A lot of people have, over the last 20 years, just accumulated usernames and passwords and iterations on usernames and passwords. Now is the time to either look at, let's have a simplified username and password system, or put in a technology system that will remember those passwords and fill it in for you whenever you go to log in. So again, it's just making things as simple as possible. So that's looking at consolidating things. Let's look at consolidating people. That sounds weird when you say it like that. But for some people, they may use more than one financial institution when it comes to investments. And when that happens, they may have more than one investment advisor. So now you're looking at, okay, well, if I need to just choose one investment advisor, who do I choose? You ideally want someone who's focused on retirement and not, helping you grow your investments and try and figure out the best way to save. You've gone through that period of life already. Now you've got to choose someone who's going to get you through the next period. So, if we're looking at investment advisors, picking the best one, it may be someone you've worked with the longest and had the most trust. If we look at the first point on here, it's, choosing the credit card you've had the longest. It could be the same way for an investment advisor. It's all built on relationships. So making sure that you're finding the person who can take you through and really get the most out of your retirement. So now we're looking at, well, what other ways can we simplify things? So let's look at, say, insurance. You may have accumulated insurance policies throughout your life. So we'll say, for example, let's look at life insurance. You may have a number of different life insurance policies at various different companies, whether it be companies you've worked for or insurance companies that you've taken policies out from. Put all those in front of you and say, okay, can we consolidate this down to A1 company or B1 policy? You may even go as far to say, well, we've saved throughout our career. Do we actually need life insurance anymore? And that's when you can start to just cross all these things out and make things really simple. But let's say you do need all these things. Well, now let's look at, well, how can we take care of the everyday life? So that's looking at, what bills do we have each month? Can we automate those? I know a lot of people have done bill pay and automated lots of things, but I still come across clients who whip out their checkbook every month and they're writing checks here, there, and everywhere for water bill, garbage, electric, cable, and that's just the way they've done it. But it doesn't necessarily make life easier. So if you're open to moving things onto a more automated technological track, that's where you can then say, okay, let's move all of our bills to auto pay, and we can save all that time and paper, and let's get all of our bills electronically through to our emails. We don't have to get all that in the mail. And if we go on vacation, we have to stop that mail. All of these have the trickle-on effects. So electronically moving everything and automating everything definitely does make things simpler. Now, I went through and consolidated my bank and moved from 2 banks down to 1. It's awful. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's not nice at all. So you definitely don't want to rush into this and just make it overwhelming. So I would say, okay, if you're looking at, okay, if you've got 2 banks, let's move it down to 1. That's the only thing you focus on. And then you look at, okay, if we've got bills that we're still paying by check, once we've moved to the bank, next month, we'll then start to set up the auto pay. The next month after that, let's look at our insurances, or if it's 2 months or 3 months, but just focus on one thing at a time, because there's no deadline to this. If you enter in retirement and you're still working on this, that's fine. But just as long as you're working through the process.
It strikes me that these could be steps for anyone who wants to simplify their life, is not necessarily just retirement.
I agree. I mean, you can do it at any point in your life. But I think when people get to retirement, there's so much emotion that goes into that whole transition that the more you can take off your plate really makes it a lot easier. So it becomes down to, okay, well, where do you start? One thing, there's a lot of advice online about how you can figure out, what type of accounts do you have? What's the best credit card for a retiree if they're traveling versus staying at home, based on different activities you want to do. But you probably know some people who've gone through it already. You probably know some people who've gone through the transition into retirement. You can ask them, okay, well, what did you do? What did you find easiest? What kind of timeline did you go on? Who are you using as an investment advisor that's focused on retirement versus something else? Gather all the pros and cons from people who've been there before. As we're talking about advisors, definitely meet with one who's that focused, but take your time with that too. Like, that's not something to jump into, finding an advisor that is going to take you through that transition and help you all the way through. That's definitely something to take your time with. The last thing to look at is the habits you've gained. If you have a habit of writing checks every month and gathering all your paper statements and just building piles, that's something to look at and say, well, maybe we don't do that anymore. And we start to eliminate that habit. The whole habit thing can go in various different tangents, but if we're looking at this financial piece, that's what we'll just stick our focus on. So there's definitely a transition with how you go ahead and simplify life up into retirement and into retirement, but make it a process. Definitely use online resources that you have, and ask people questions as you go along the way.
Well, this has been such an informative short webinar. I really appreciate the insight that you brought us, Dave. And I want to thank the organizations that have made this possible today. And go ahead and go to the next slide there. On behalf of Advice Chaser, we want to thank you for being here on our webinar today. Here at Advice Chaser, we're all about helping you find a financial advisor who's a great fit for your life and your financial questions. Our matching service is free to you, and every one of our advisor partners is committed to offer a free initial consultation to anyone we introduce them to. Find out more by going to advicechaser.com and clicking on the link to find an advisor. Once again, from Advice Chaser, thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you at another presentation very soon. Goodbye.